the crimson twin suns of Zoraxis 4. Hung low on the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the barren wasteland that served as humanity's latest alliance training ground. Grace wiped perspiration from her brow as she adjusted her atmospheric regulator, the device humming softly against her chest. Around her fellow cadets from across the galaxy moved through their survival exercises. Their diverse anatomies adapted to their respective homeworlds, but struggling against this planet's harsh conditions. The training facility itself was a marvel of interspecies engineering, a complex of interconnected modules that could simulate a variety of environmental challenges. High-tech atmospheric processors maintained breathable air within the facility, while holographic chambers provided virtual scenarios from 100 different worlds. For Grace, a human from the outer colonies of Earth's domain, this represented the pinnacle of technological achievement. Commander Zolvar, a towering Zentari with 6 arms and coal-black carapace, surveyed the day's exercises with his compound eyes. His species had evolved on a world with dense methane-rich atmosphere, making Zoraxis 4's thin air particularly challenging. He paused beside Grace, his mandibles clicking with what might have been amusement. "Human Grace," he chittered in the trade language. "Your performance in low-oxygen scenarios continues to exceed expectations. Perhaps your species' primitive respiratory system has unexpected advantages." Grace bit back a retort. She had grown accustomed to such backhanded compliments during her months at the academy, while her fellow cadets possessed advanced technological augmentations and came from species with millennia of space travel. Humans were still considered newcomers to the galactic community, crude in their methods, primitive in their thinking. Jacques, a Vorthan cadet, with crystalline skin that shimmered blue-green in the alien sunlight, floated past, using his species' natural gravitational manipulation. "Indeed, Commander. Though I wonder if such advantages will matter when we face real challenges that require sophisticated solutions." The jab was typical of Rizek, who seemed to take particular pleasure in reminding Grace of humanity's perceived inferiority. His species had mastered quantum field manipulation. Before humans had even discovered fire or so, he frequently reminded anyone within earshot. Rausik, a more diplomatic cadet from the aquatic world of Nereid, rippled his tentacles in what Grace had learned was equivalent to a grimace. The Nereidian had always been kind to her, perhaps because his own species was often underestimated due to their need for constant moisture regulation. The day's exercise was meant to test their ability to establish emergency shelters during equipment failures. Grace had built a simple but effective lean-to using debris, and her emergency tarp focusing on maximizing insulation and creating multiple air pockets. Her design was unremarkable compared to the advanced force field shelters and nanomaterial constructs her classmates had created, but it would function reliably without power. As the suns began their descent toward the horizon, signaling the approach of Zoraxis 4's brutal night, the cadets began making their way back to the facility. Grace was securing her gear when the first alarm sounded, a low modulated tone that sent ice through her veins. Commander Zolvar's voice crackled through the comm system. "All cadets report to the main facility immediately. This is not a drill." The second alarm began as Grace reached the facility's airlock. This one was higher-pitched, more urgent. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in an ominous red glow as cadets from all corners of the training ground converged on the main assembly area. Commander Zolvar stood at the center of the chamber, his usually imposing demeanor tinged with what Grace recognized as concern. Around him, holographic displays showed steadily declining atmospheric readings. "Cadets." He began his translator rendering his chittering into the common tongue. "We have experienced a critical system failure. The primary atmospheric processors have malfunctioned, and our backup systems are operating at only 60% in efficiency. Current oxygen levels are dropping at an exponential rate." A murmur of unease rippled through the assembled group. Advanced species or not, they all needed oxygen to survive, even if in different ratios than humans. Engineering teams are working on the problem, Zolvar continued, but preliminary estimates suggest repairs could take 18 to 24 standard hours. At current consumption rates, we have approximately 8 hours of breathable air remaining. The murmur became a buzz of worried conversation. 8 hours. Not nearly enough time. Jacques stepped forward, his crystalline form pulsing with agitation. Commander, surely our individual atmospheric recyclers can sustain us for that duration. Negative, Zolvar replied grimly. This facility was designed with redundant life support systems that have apparently cascaded into failure. Personal recyclers will extend survival time by perhaps 1 hour per individual. Grace felt her stomach drop. 9 hours total. Maybe 10 if they were careful. Still not enough. Sir? Interjected Kylara. A hegemonic cadet whose species had developed powerful biotechnology. Our medical bays are equipped with emergency stasis pods. We could place individuals in suspended animation to reduce oxygen consumption. Already considered, Zolvar responded. The pods require significant power to operate, and our energy grid is currently diverted to maintaining partial atmosphere. We can manage perhaps 6 pods simultaneously. 37 cadets were present in the facility. 6 pods meant 6 survivors. As the reality of their situation settled over the group, panic began to set in. Several cadets immediately began checking their personal recyclers, adjusting settings to eke out every possible minute of functionality. Others clustered around the few available terminals, frantically researching alternative solutions in the facility's database. Grace found herself thinking not of high-tech solutions, but of a biology lesson from her childhood on the agricultural colonies. She remembered her teacher explaining how Earth's earliest settlers had used algae farms to supplement oxygen production in their habitats. It was primitive technology by current standards, abandoned in favor of more efficient molecular atmospheric processors, but it had worked for centuries. Pushing through the crowd of increasingly agitated cadets, Grace made her way to one of the facility's maintenance areas. The training complex had been built with modular sections that could simulate various environments, which meant it likely had some equipment that might be adaptable. She found what she was looking for in Storage Bay 7, several biological sample containers that had been used for exobiology exercises. They weren't designed as algae tanks, but the principles were similar enough that they might work. More importantly, she had noticed several specimens of what appeared to be oxygen-producing organisms during their earlier studies. Organisms that had been cultured for educational purposes and then largely forgotten. Returning to the main assembly area, Grace found chaos. Several cadets were arguing loudly about priority access to the stasis pods, while others had begun rationing their personal air supplies. Commander Zolvar was deep in conversation with his senior staff, their expressions growing darker by the minute. "Commander?" Grace called out, her voice cutting through the din. "I may have a solution." The room fell silent, all compound eyes optical sensors and various other sensory organs focusing on her. Rzek's chittering laughter broke the quiet. "The human thinks she can solve what our greatest minds cannot." His derision was palpable. What could your primitive species possibly offer that we haven't already considered? Grace met his gaze steadily. Algae tanks? Biological oxygen production. The silence stretched longer this time. Commander Zolvar tilted his massive head, studying her with 2 of his many eyes. "Explain," he commanded. Grace took a deep breath, acutely aware that she was proposing to save their lives with what amounted to pond scum. The facility has biological samples from various worlds, including oxygen-producing algae from Earth and similar organisms from other planets. In Storage Bay 7, there are sample containers that could be modified into basic cultivation tanks. It's not sophisticated, but it would produce oxygen. Dr. Thane. The facility's chief scientist, a spindly arachnoid with a brilliant mind for biochemistry, stepped forward. His multiple limbs gestured with what Grace had learned indicated intense thought. "The concept has merit," he admitted slowly. "Earth's primitive atmospheric producers were famously reliable if inefficient by modern standards. The question becomes whether we can establish sufficient biomass to meaningfully impact our survival timeline. Jacques scoffed audibly. You're seriously considering farming. During a crisis, our nanoatmospheric processors can create oxygen at the molecular level. Our nanoatmospheric processors, Zolvar reminded him pointedly, are currently non-functional. Grace seized the moment. I can set up the tanks. I've studied the process my family worked on the agricultural colonies before I joined the academy. We kept algae farms as backup oxygen sources. It's not pretty and it's not fast, but it works. Dr. Thane's optical array focused on her with new interest. What requirements would you need? Access to the biological samples, some basic cultivation nutrients, and help moving the equipment. The organisms will need specific lighting and temperature control, but that's manageable with portable units. Silence fell again as the assembled cadets and instructors processed this. Here was their crisis-sophisticated beings with technology that could reshape matter at the subatomic level reduced to considering pond scum as their salvation. Commander Zolvar made the decision. Do it. Dr. Thane assist Grace with technical requirements. All cadets not assigned to repair teams will assist as needed. What followed was a flurry of organized chaos. Grace led teams to Storage Bay 7, where they retrieved the largest biological sample containers, cylindrical units about 2 meters tall and 1 meter in diameter. These weren't designed as cultivation tanks, but their basic systems could be modified. The first challenge came when they opened the containers. The mechanisms were designed for containment, not cultivation, and several units had sealed locks that required specialized codes. Stand aside, Rizek muttered, hovering over one stubborn container. I'll demonstrate how superior technology handles primitive equipment. He extended his hand, quantum fields shimmering around his fingers as he attempted to manipulate the lock at the molecular level. The container's error lights began flashing more insistently, and a defensive electrical discharge sent him sprawling. The locks are biokeyed, Dr. Thane observed dryly. They're programmed to respond to specific genetic markers from the species that stored samples in them. Grace examined the readout display more carefully. These are from Earth archives. They're keyed to human genetics. She placed her palm on the scanner, and the container hissed open. One by one, she opened the containers while the other cadets focused on moving equipment, setting up lighting arrays, and preparing nutrient solutions. The work was sweaty, physical, and entirely manual. No amount of technological sophistication could replace good old-fashioned labor. Finding the algae samples took time. The containers held specimens from dozens of worlds, carefully preserved in stasis. Grace finally located what she was looking for: several varieties of Earth algae, a fast-growing chlorophyll analog from Centauri B, and something that looked promising from the vegan system. This one, she said, pointing to a particularly vigorous-looking green specimen. It's engineered for high oxygen production rates. We used this strain on the outer colonies. Dr. Thane studied the sample with his magnification organs. Remarkable. Such simple organisms, yet their efficiency in converting carbon dioxide to oxygen is quite respectable. Rusek undulated closer, his aquatic sensory organs examining the specimens with interest. My people have long respected such biological solutions. Not everything that is old is obsolete. The next challenge was setting up the cultivation systems. The container's environmental controls were designed for preservation, not cultivation. They needed to be rewired to provide proper lighting circulation and temperature regulation for living cultures. Grace found herself working alongside cadets who, hours before, had considered her methods quaint at best. Rizek, his pride apparently bruised by his earlier failure with the locking mechanism, sulked as he used his quantum field manipulation to help modify the equipment. His advanced abilities reduced to carefully adjusting nutrient particle concentrations. Kylara proved particularly helpful, her species' biotechnology expertise, making her invaluable in creating optimal growing conditions. Your organisms are remarkably robust, she commented as they prepared the first tank. Our bioengineered solutions are far more fragile. Setting up the first tank took 3 precious hours during which the facility's oxygen levels continued to drop. Some cadets had already begun supplementing with their personal recyclers as the air grew noticeably thinner. Grace inoculated the first tank with a carefully measured portion of algae sample watching as the dormant organisms began to activate under the proper conditions. The growth would take time, even with optimal conditions. She estimated several more hours before significant oxygen production would begin. It's not enough, Rzek stated flatly. One tank, even at optimal performance, cannot sustain 37 beings. He was right, of course. Grace had already run the calculations. They needed multiple tanks, and they needed them working simultaneously. Then we set up more tanks, she replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. We have 8 more containers, enough algae samples to seed them all, and she checked her chronometer 4.5 hours before we reached critical oxygen depletion. What followed was a race against time and biology. Grace coordinated the setup of tank after tank, dividing the precious algae cultures to create as many production centers as possible. Other cadets fetched supplies, monitored environmental controls, and tried to optimize every variable under Dr. Thane's guidance. The work was exhausting, made worse by the continuously thinning air. Several cadets had collapsed from exertion and were placed on personal recyclers full-time. Grace herself felt lightheaded and sluggish, but pushed through, driven by the knowledge that every minute counted. As the 5th tank came online, a new problem emerged. The facility's power grid, already strained by the failing life support systems, began displaying warnings. The cultivation tanks, with their lighting arrays and circulation pumps, were drawing significant power. We're approaching brownout conditions, reported Ensign Vex, a draconian engineer who had been monitoring systems. The power drain from the algae tanks is competing with environmental controls. Commander Zolvar made a quick decision. Shut down all non-essential systems. All personal quarters are now offline. Emergency lighting only in non-critical areas. The facility dimmed as power was redirected to the makeshift life support system. In the cultivation area, the algae tanks continued their slow miracle, converting the facility's atmosphere into something more sustainable. Grace monitored the first tank, obsessively watching for any signs of activity. The organisms were growing. She could see that under magnification. But would it be fast enough? Had she calculated the rates correctly? Her childhood education on agricultural methods felt suddenly inadequate compared to the stakes at hand. Hour 6 arrived with little visible progress. The air had grown thin enough that most cadets were now rationing their movements, conserving energy and oxygen. Several of the smaller species had been placed in the medical bay with supplemental support. It was Rusek who first noticed the change. His aquatic senses, evolved for detecting minute chemical variations in water, were sensitive enough to detect the slight shift in atmospheric composition. Oxygen levels, he gurgled excitedly, they're incrementally increasing. Grace felt a surge of hope, but checked the readings herself. He was right, barely detectable, but the downward plunge of oxygen levels had slowed. The algae were working. Tank by tank, the cultivation systems began showing results. The organisms, simple though they were, began their ancient work of photosynthesis, converting the facility's carbon dioxide back into breathable atmosphere. But it wasn't enough yet. Hour 7 brought a new crisis. 2 of the hegemonic cadets had reached critical oxygen levels and required immediate intervention. The medical staff working with the limited stasis pods managed to stabilize them, but the incident drove home how close to the edge they all were. Grace made a desperate decision. Looking at the partially set up 9th tank, she realized they needed more biomass faster. She began combining algae cultures from different worlds, creating hybrid populations that might produce oxygen more efficiently than any single species. That's extremely dangerous, Dr. Thane warned. Unknown species interactions could result in ecological collapse of your systems. Or it could save us all. Grace replied, adding the vegan algae to a tank that already contained Earth and Centauri specimens. We're past the point of safe choices. As the 8th hour dawned, something remarkable happened. The hybrid cultures in the 9th tank began showing unprecedented growth rates. The different algae species, rather than competing, had formed a symbiotic relationship. The vegan organisms provided nutrients that the Earth algae converted into acceleration factors for the Centauri specimens, creating a feedback loop of accelerated oxygen production. Tank 9's oxygen output began climbing rapidly. Then, the other tanks showed similar improvement as the hybrid organisms were introduced. The facility's atmospheric readings stabilized, then began slowly climbing. Grace collapsed into a chair, exhaustion finally overwhelming her adrenaline-fueled determination. Around her, cadets were beginning to show signs of recovery as the air improved. There were cheers or the closest equivalent various species could manage as the danger passed. Commander Zolvar approached his massive form, moving with unusual care. "Cadet Grace?" He began formally, then paused. "Your solution was elegant in its simplicity." High praise from a Centauri, particularly one who had initially dismissed her as primitive. Dr. Thane examined the thriving algae tanks with obvious fascination. "I must admit your species' biological technologies have been unfairly overlooked. The efficiency of these systems, once established, rivals our best atmospheric processors." Jacques, who had worked tirelessly despite his earlier objections, hovered nearby. His usual arrogance seemed deflated. "I apologize for my earlier comments. Your methods may be different from ours, but they are undeniably effective." Over the following hours, as the atmospheric levels returned to normal and the facility's primary life support systems were gradually repaired, a transformation had occurred among the cadets. Human ingenuity was no longer seen as primitive, but as an alternative approach with its own merits. Grace found herself fielding questions about Earth's biological technologies, agricultural traditions, and survival methodologies. Species that had mastered quantum mechanics and dimensional engineering were suddenly interested in composting, soil management, and biological recycling systems. Rousek was particularly fascinated by the algae cultivation process. Such elegant simplicity, he mused, watching the thriving cultures. "We often assume complexity equals superiority, but your simple solutions are remarkably robust." In the days that followed, as the facility returned to normal operation, the algae tanks were kept running. Commander Zolvar officially designated them as backup life support systems, a primitive technology perhaps, but one that had literally saved their lives. Grace's fellow cadets began approaching her with new respect. Where once they had seen her low-tech solutions as quaint, they now understood them as an entirely valid approach to problem-solving. Her methods weren't inferior. They were different, bringing diversity to their tactical thinking. The incident became a case study at the Academy, though not for the reasons one might expect. Rather than focusing on equipment failure or emergency procedures, it emphasized the value of diverse approaches and the danger of technological overdependence. Grace eventually graduated with highest honors. Her algae cultivation expertise, leading to her assignment with the Alliance's exploration fleet, where biological backup systems became standard equipment. But more importantly, the experience had changed how the various species viewed each other. The Centauri began incorporating human-style backup systems into their designs. The Vorthons started studying biological engineering as a complement to their quantum technologies. The Nereids shared their own simple but effective survival techniques. Years later, when Grace commanded her own vessel, she always maintained a small algae cultivation bay alongside the ship's primary atmospheric systems, not because she expected the main systems to fail, but because she had learned that sometimes the simplest solutions were also the most reliable. Her diverse crew beings from a dozen different worlds understood this too. They had learned that survival often depended not on having the most advanced technology, but on having the right tool for the situation, whether that was a quantum field manipulator or a tank full of pond scum. The algae tanks on Xeraxis 4 still operated years later, maintained by new generations of cadets. They served as both backup life support and constant reminder in a universe full of advanced technology. Never underestimate the elegant power of simple solutions. And in the facility's main corridor, a small plaque commemorated the incident. It read simply, "In emergency, simplicity saves. In diversity, strength." Human Cadet Grace Class, 2157 Algae Cultivation Protocol. The plaque was visited regularly by cadets from across the galaxy, each learning that true advancement came not from abandoning the old ways, but from integrating the best of all approaches into something greater than the sum of its parts. Grace's story became legend, not because she was human, but because she had demonstrated a fundamental truth. Survival belonged not to the most advanced, but to the most adaptable. And sometimes adaptation meant looking backward to move forward.